coming up on The World Today. Leaders from across the world pay tribute to Mikhail Gorbachev, who died in Moscow at the age of 91. International Atomic Energy Agency arrives Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia. Plus, President Biden says it's sickening to see attacks on the FBI to search on Trump's Florida home. Hello and welcome to the program in Lagos. I'm Millicent Walker. We begin with news of Mikhail Gorbachev, who has died at the age of 91. The Central Clinic Hospital in Moscow said late last night that he died after a serious and long illness. Gorbachev was best known for opening up the USSR to the world. Many Russians blame him and his policies for the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Vladimir Putin sees as a historic mistake. The head of the UN said Gorbachev changed the course of history, while U.S. President Joe Biden called him a rare leader who imagined a different future for his country. But for the Kremlin spokesman, he says he was a statesman who will go down in history and that his romanticism about relations with the West did not work out.
December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev announcing his resignation as Soviet president. Gorbachev, the last Soviet president, forged arms reduction deals with the United States and partnerships with Western powers to remove the Iron Curtain that had divided Europe and bring about the reunification of Germany. When pro-democracy protests swept across the Soviet bloc nations of communist Eastern Europe in 1989, he refrained from using force, unlike previous Kremlin leaders who had sent tanks to crush uprisings in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. But the protests fueled aspirations for autonomy in the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, which disintegrated over the next 2 years in chaotic fashion.
Impressions of each other.
On becoming General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party in 1985, aged just 54, he had set out to revitalize the system by introducing limited political and economic freedoms. But his reforms spun out of control.
As I leave Malta for Brussels in a meeting with our NATO allies, I am optimistic that as the West works patiently together and increasingly cooperates with the Soviet Union, we can realize a lasting peace and transform the East-West relationship to one of enduring cooperation. And that is a future that's worthy of our peoples, and that's the future that I want to help in creating, and that's the future that Chairman Gorbachev and I began right here in Malta. Thank you, sir, for your hospitality.
On July 31, 1991, Gorbachev and Reagan's successor, George Bush, signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, cutting their nuclear arsenals by about 1/3. Days later, Gorbachev left Moscow to begin a holiday in the Crimea, where he and his family were held hostage as hardliners opposed to his reforms staged an inept, short-lived coup. His longtime opponent, Boris Yeltsin, then president of the Russian Republic, led the resistance to the coup and emerged as the principal focus of opposition to Gorbachev's policies. His policy of glasnost, free speech, allowed previously unthinkable criticism of the party and the state, but also emboldened nationalists who began to press for independence in the Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and elsewhere. Many Russians never forgave Gorbachev for the turbulence that his reforms unleashed, considering the subsequent plunge in their living standards, too high a price to pay for democracy. Mikhail Gorbachev, who ended the Cold War without bloodshed, but failed to prevent the collapse of the Soviet Union, died on Tuesday at the age of 91.
Meanwhile, tributes are still pouring in for Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. We begin in Russia as they woke up to the news of the former Soviet leader's death, and maybe it wasn't top news on their morning bulletin in terms of their media, but then they prepared obituaries on the Gorbachev's legacy and devoted considerably more time to the conflict in Ukraine and the Moscow forum involving key Russian figures taking place today. Over in the United Kingdom, the media outlets had headlines reading Mikhail Gorbachev, Soviet leader who ended the Cold War, dies age 91, or Gorbachev, USSR's last leader, dies at 91. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson paid tribute to the former Soviet leader. Speaking in London, he praised him, saying he was one of those people who changed the world unquestionably for the better.
Mikhail Gorbachev is one of those people who changed the world and unquestionably changed it for the better. When you look at what he did to make Europe whole, free, to give freedom to the countries of the former Soviet Union, it was a quite extraordinary thing. And of course, Mikhail Gorbachev is one of those people who triggered a series of changes that perhaps he didn't anticipate. Maybe he paid his own political price for it. But when history is written, he will be, I think, one of the authors of fantastic change for the better in the world. And what I worry about today is that the current leadership in Moscow is intent on undoing the good that Mikhail Gorbachev did, and is intent on a revanchist attempt, a revenge-driven attempt to recreate that Soviet empire. And you're seeing that in Ukraine today, and that's the tragedy. It's something that I think Mikhail Gorbachev would have thought was absolutely unthinkable and unwarranted and irrational.
Emmanuel Macron expressed his condolences to the Russian people after the death of Gorbachev. Macron remembered him as a man of peace whose decisions paved the way for freedom for the Russians. Gorbachev made a 3-day visit to France in July 1989 as part of a Western European diplomatic offensive. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz as well commemorated Mikhail Gorbachev as a courageous reformer and a statesman who dared to do many things. Speaking at a cabinet event north of Berlin, Scholz said Gorbachev had died at a time when not only has democracy in Russia failed, and the Russian president is digging new trenches in Europe and has started a terrible war against a neighboring country, Ukraine. Over in Asia, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida offered his condolences as well, praising his legacy as a world leader who supported the abolishment of nuclear weapons. China's foreign ministry today as well expressed sorrow over the passing of the former Soviet leader, saying he had made positive contributions to the normalization of Chinese-Soviet relations. Over in Africa, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari paid tribute to Gorbachev in a tweet by his special assistant on media and publicity, Mr. Garba Shehu. The president described him as a courageous reformer who will be remembered for years to come because of his immeasurable contributions to world peace and openness about his own once rigidly closed society. The president added that although Gorbachev died without achieving his dream of a nuclear-free world, his genuine commitment to durable international peace and security would never be forgotten. Well, joining us now is Dr. Joe Andura. He joins me from Moscow. He's a veterinary doctor, but the former president of the Nigerian Student Union during the USSR, also during Mikhail Gorbachev's time. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining me on the program.
Thank you for having me on your program.
All right, Dr. Andura, how would you describe the man Gorbachev?
Well, I came to Soviet Union and Gorbachev became president when I was a student. And as far as I know, Gorbachev is civilized, humble, educated, and an orator. That concerns his own personality. And he was loved by the people of Soviet Union then, because he started an unprecedented way of interacting with his people.
Gorbachev has been described as one of the people who changed the world. This is according to Boris Johnson. We also heard the Japanese Prime Minister who praised him for his legacy in nuclear disarmament. Do you agree with, some of these tributes being poured out?
Yes, I completely agree, and I also endorse those, statements or feelings. But on the other hand, I would say that his achievements, as far as the international community is concerned, they are divided into two categories. Gorbachev will always remain a perfect man for the West as far as his policies were concerned. Of course, during his time, he tried to bring the West and the East together. He ended the Cold War, which is a credit to him. The West and the East started talking together. And during his time, he made frantic efforts to reduce nuclear warheads, something which was unheard of. But both the West and the East, and to be precise, America and USSR sat down on a round table and started armed negotiation. At the end of the day, they had reduction in nuclear warheads, and they kept reducing. His own dream was to really rid the whole world of nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, this is yet to happen. One of the achievements, which also on the international scene he did, was to bring down the Iron Curtain. That is, for example, the Berlin Wall was brought down, and then we saw the easy reunification of East and Western Germany. That is also a credit to him.
So, Dr. Ndura, those are sort of like the positives, but why does it appear Russians have mixed feelings about his sort of legacy?
Yes, it's mixed. Even on the international scene, you have mixed feelings, just as internally, because you have those who are pro-West. They love all what he did on the international scene, but those who are not saw it as something like not being very firm on the issues concerning, security. Internally, they really appreciate what he did. He laid the foundation for democratic processes and economic and market economy. He brought freedom, glasnost as they used to call it, restructuring, freedom of speech. But then, with all this, the end was the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which majority don't like it. If all what he did, and at the end of the day, Soviet Union remained as a superpower as a country, I think there will be no person with mixed feelings. They appreciate what he did, but this is just the only thing that they hold against him. The issue of allowing Soviet Union as a superpower to disintegrate. They felt he did not negotiate strong enough and gave in into the demands of the West, and they took advantage of it.
Are the alliances from the time of the former republics of the Soviet Union, are they the same or have things changed?
Things have changed drastically over the years, as you will, you are also aware. Some of the former Soviet republics, especially the Baltic states, they are also in NATO, bloc. And it is also one of the things that people don't really like. It's like one country disintegrated, and some of those republics have gone to join, the NATO ally, which is considered as a hostile organization towards, USSR and Russia at the present. You have, and then apart from that, some of the former Soviet states, those who have not been able to join NATO, still have their eyes and they are shifting their policy towards NATO, which is also very disturbing. But you still have some of the former Soviet states that they have formed alliance with Russia, which they are cooperating militarily, economically, and otherwise.
I'd like to finally ask, and this is if you are aware, what was his view of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or what Russia refers to as the special military operation?
Well, Gorbachev, after he was, he left the political arena, in 1996, he tried to make a comeback. He formed a party. Unfortunately, he got less than 1% in the presidential election. And after that, he had tried to be away from the political scene, not really commenting or interfering, in the activities of the country. But of late, he was sick, and I think it is one of the reasons why we have been able to find out his own position regarding the special operation going on presently in Ukraine.
Well, Dr. Joe Andura, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me on the program on this issue. And European foreign ministers and representatives of the European Union have met in Prague, Czech Republic. And this is to discuss the potential ban, a visa ban that is, for Russian citizens. Estonian foreign minister called for quick action before the informal meeting. Other countries, such as Germany, France, they've come out against the visa ban, with the German foreign minister saying the Schengen visa helps people trying to leave Russia, such as journalists or students. They also had a thing or two to say with regards to Mikhail Gorbachev's death.
It needs more weapons immediately. It needs new sanctions package. It needs a ban of entry of Russian Federation citizens into European Union. And we could take a slower path by that road, as we have done with 7 earlier packages. But I think the timing is crucial, and that loss of time is paid by blood of Ukrainians. I think for the perspective of mankind and for the perspective of the European history, it was good he started reforms, and it was in a way good that the reforms didn't end where he was aiming to end these reforms.
Well, Mikhail Gorbachev sent a wind of freedom into Russian society. He tried to change the communist system from inside, which became impossible. And he started an era of cooperation with the West, stopping the Cold War. And happily, the hopes has vanished. We have been asking for an immediate demilitarization of the neighborhood of this atomic central, the biggest atomic power central in the whole Europe. We cannot play war games in the neighborhood of a site like this. So I hope that the Atomic Energy Agency will be able to restore the situation, and certainly we have to continue putting pressure for the complete demilitarization of this part of the Ukrainian territory.
Coming up on the program, we have more on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, still more on the tribute to Gorbachev, plus mourners mark Princess Diana's death. We have that and more in a moment. Welcome back. And while Mikhail Gorbachev was mourned in the West as a towering statesman who helped to end the Cold War, his death received a different response from some in Ukraine, a former territory of the Soviet Union. Daria, a 34-year-old Zaporizhzhia resident, said since the first and the last president died, it meant the Soviet Union will never come back. Ukraine officially declared itself an independent country on the 24th of August 1991. This is after 72 years of Soviet Union rule. And back to banning Russian visas, Lithuanian Foreign Minister called for tougher measures on EU visas for Russian tourists. He said that large numbers of people are crossing the border to Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland with visas issued by other member states. The EU's foreign policy chief, we heard him urging bickering nations to settle their differences on restricting travel for Russian citizens, saying Europe must remain united over Moscow's 6 months after invasion of Ukraine. Now, that step would make Russians wait longer, pay more for travel visas to EU countries.
Well, honestly, I don't think that visa facilitation, cancelling the visa facilitation agreement is enough. It's a step to the right direction, but surely not the whole trip. That the countries in the region who have a border with Belarus or Russia are asking. I'm hoping for a fruitful debate. I think that this is one of those cases when actually, a debate at the table has to happen, and I'm still hoping that it can bear fruit. Hundreds of thousands of people we're seeing crossing the border to Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and Finland. They have visas that are being issued by other member states, and a big group of those people are actually staying in the border countries. That means that somebody else is inviting them in, and they they continue to stay, and it is an issue. It's a safety issue, because the country is at war, and big numbers of people actually have been already at the front. They can come back and go to a spa in the town of Lithuania after spending some time at the front. So the notion of this is not particularly well taken by the public in the Baltic. For 3 decades, Western European countries were not listening to the Baltics, and were trying to win hearts and minds. We're paying huge amounts of money for the gas, and inviting tourists and all whatnot. And out of this, we got 2008 war in Georgia, 2014 occupation of Crimea, and now we have a full-scale war in Ukraine. So that's how many hearts and minds we've won in Russia. It's time to wake up.
And finally, the IAEA's team are in Zaporizhzhia on the fact-finding mission. Grossi, in his visit to Ukraine, Zaporizhzhia, he said it was a technical mission that aimed to prevent a nuclear accident. The mission arrived Zaporizhzhia, some 55 kilometers away from the plant, where Mr. Grossi told journalists the inspection visit would take a few days. He added that the plant is a Ukrainian facility, despite being currently occupied by Russian forces. The mission came after weeks of shelling nearby sparked fears of a radiation disaster, with tensions rising between Kyiv and Moscow over the visit.
This is what we are concentrating on.
And to other stories, in the United States, President Joe Biden has said that he was sickened by attacks on the FBI after the agency's search of former President Donald Trump's home earlier this month. Mr. Biden added he was opposed to defunding the FBI as well as other police agencies. Former President Trump's Florida estate was searched earlier this month as part of an ongoing investigation into whether he illegally retained government records. He has accused the FBI of a partisan witch hunt Hunt, and his rhetoric has led to online threats against the agency. Visiting Pennsylvania, Mr. Biden laid out plans that include asking Congress for $37 billion for crime prevention programs and providing some of that money to police to reduce gun crime.
I'm opposed to defunding the police. I'm also opposed to defunding the FBI. Let them see you.
In the meantime, a United Nations committee released a report which focused on the staggering discrimination facing racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination report said the U.S. Supreme Court decision ending a federal right to abortion will affect racial and ethnic minorities to a greater extent. According to the report, the racial and ethnic minority groups in the U.S. are disproportionately impacted by higher maternal mortality and morbidity rates, higher risk of unwanted pregnancies, and lack of means to overcome socioeconomic barriers to access safe abortions. Additionally, the report also gave emphasis on such issues as the abuse of power, excessive law enforcement, and use of force against racial and ethnic minorities by law enforcement agencies in the United States. The committee is calling on the U.S. to review and regulate the law enforcement's use of force and step up supervision, as well as the system of accountability in this regard. Well, our correspondent, Maria Bird, joins us now with regards to Trump's search and the United States response, the president's response to that. Hi, Maria. Welcome. Let's talk about, this matter with the FBI. What really is the latest?
Well, at this time, yes, definitely in the document were claimed to be classified document. And until yesterday, someone like a watchdog, someone that would be able to ensure that what was happening within legal limitation. We're now going to see what's going to come forth and be able to identify what the next steps will be. As we all know, we've heard that the president has obviously been questioned about this, but he is at this time staying far outside of it. Again, this is a Department of Justice investigation. This is not one that is by the executive branch of government.
Is it true that President Biden has not been briefed on the classified materials recovered from the former president's home? And if so, why not?
That is what's being said at this time. Again, in the U.S., there is a separation of power as we look at the executive, legislative branches of government. And so due to that piece, there is very highly likely that he has not seen that information yet, just to ensure that it is protected and that they don't run into any challenges as they move forward in this investigation.
We understand some strong supporters of Trump in the House say there could be a protest if former President Trump is indicted.
Yes, that's what many of the former supporters of President Trump and even some Republicans who have not always been in support of former President Trump are stating that there could be. They've even gone as far to state a civil war. Now, it's not believed that there will be any type of civil war, but I think that we can expect that there would be protest and that we would see, obviously, a rising again of a division in the U.S., especially as it relates to those who are supporters of President Trump and those who have shown to be highly supporting of the Democratic Party, but anything that is anti-Trump.
And Maria, it's a new school year. Gun violence is not abating. What more is being done by the states, the federal government, to tackle the issue?
Well, we know that just yesterday the president went out and talked about the need to fund policing. We know that that has been a major concern with the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the issues that we've seen in the U.S. over the past few years as it relates to crimes against African Americans by the police. There was a huge initiative and movement to defund the police. But now, I think the focus really is about how do we plan in community policing? How do we ensure that police are ensuring the safety and security of all people, and that we do decrease the amount of crime? We know that as of the pandemic has really rocked and shaped the United States and the American people. And we're dealing with major economic crises, which always tends to historically lead to potentially increase in crime. And so that's really what we're facing. We've even seen some of our school-age children, high schools that have been dealing with gun violence within the schools. And we've seen it right in our communities. And so I think that where the president is standing is he's really calling on Americans to stand up for the rights of all Americans, which is the right to have safety and security, and to have a ban against specific guns. We know the NRA is a major supporter of former President Trump, and they are a major supporter of firearms. But when you have this type of emergency in the U.S. as it relates to gun violence, you have to look at ways to potentially tamper that.
And how true is the assertion that ahead of the elections in November, many Republican candidates are portraying Democrats as unwilling to fight growing crime rates in some parts of the country?
That is definitely going to be utilized. I think that when we look at where Democrats have, especially as we've seen a large growth in the Progressive Party. The progressive Democrats have grown tremendously. You started to begin to see that when we saw Bernie Sanders running for office. He had quite a lot of support, and he was very much a progressive in his thoughts and his ideologies and his values. And so I think that what we're beginning to see is just like many Democrats have done with the Republican Party, is kind of put them all in a box as to be like Trump. And we know that is a much further right-standing area of thought and values. So we know that in this case, there's definitely going to be utilized a very progressive thought process as the Republicans try to ensure that even those who are centrist, we still have many Americans that stand in the center. They're not Republican or Democrat. They are kind of believe in some Democratic values. They believe in some Republican values. And so they're going to really try to capture that base to ensure that they can get through these midterm elections in a way that puts more Republicans in the House and Senate.
Maria Bird, our Washington, D.C. correspondent. Thanks. And we go over to the United Kingdom. Royal fans and mourners paid respect to Princess Diana at the gate of Kensington Palace today on the 25th anniversary of her death. People laid flowers at the gate, which was adorned with pictures of Diana. Some prayed, others sung Welsh hymns. Jane Crook, a 64-year-old school worker, travelled from Wales especially to visit the memorial, which she said transported her back 25 years. She said it's like yesterday. The princess was just 36 when the limousine carrying her and her Dodi Al Fayed crashed in Paris as it sped away from photographers who were chasing it on motorbikes. And to British politics, Queen Elizabeth will break with tradition to appoint Britain's new Prime Minister at her Balmoral Castle residence in Scotland rather than at Buckingham Palace in London due to the 96-year-old monarch's mobility issues. A Buckingham Palace spokesperson said that the Queen would meet outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson as well as his successor on September the 6th at Balmoral, where the monarch spends her summers. She will have an audience with Britain's new leader, either Foreign Secretary Liz Truss or former Finance Minister Rishi Sunak, shortly after the meeting with Johnson. Meanwhile, the result of the Conservative Party leadership contest to succeed Johnson will be announced September the 5th, with polls making Truss the clear front-runner. According to a palace source, the decision to have the audiences at Balmoral was taken to provide certainty for the new Prime Minister's diary and avoid having to make any last-minute changes where the Queen to experience mobility issues. And now to Asia, where at least 10 people have died, including 7 children waiting for their school bus when a trailer truck plowed into a telecommunications pole outside a school in Indonesia's West Java. Latif Usman, a traffic policeman at the scene, said the school children were waiting at a bus stop after class in the city of Bekasi when a trailer suddenly veered towards them, crashed into 2 motorcycles and toppled a communications tower. Ms. Usman said police is investigating whether the brakes of the truck failed, as the vehicle was allegedly speeding over 60 kilometers per hour. South Korea and the United States continued joint military drills known as Uchi Freedom Shield, UFS, today as the allies seek to tighten readiness over North Korea's potential weapons test. Footage and photographs showed South Korean and American soldiers participating in drills in a forested area, while Navy personnel were seen simulating an operation at a container port. South Korea's defense minister also visited a command post and met the commanding general of the U.S. troops. For the first time, a South Korean general is commanding annual joint drills with American forces, and for the U.S. military, it's a step towards Seoul's long-delayed goal of gaining command of allied forces in the war, in the event of a war. Now, the annual summertime exercises, which kicked off Monday and are scheduled to end September 1st, came after South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol vowed to normalize the combined exercises and boost deterrence against the North.
Ready to and all clear. We are here for the long haul. Our alliance is strong. I couldn't imagine it being any stronger. As long as there's a threat out there, it gives us purpose to train and purpose to have a scenario and an exercise such as this.
Elsewhere, in a different development, period poverty is a global issue that affects women and girls around the world, as many do not have access to menstrual hygiene products. According to UNESCO, 1 in 10 schoolgirls in Africa misses school or even drops out from school for reasons related to periods. In South Africa, 30% of girls who do not have access to sanitary products can miss up to 90 school days a year due to having monthly periods. In some countries, women and girls who cannot afford sanitary pads put their health at risk by using things like paper towels, cow dung, and even leaves. A group of young protesters alongside Team Free Sanitary Pads marched from the seat of South African government, the Union Buildings in Pretoria, and this is to hand over their memorandum of demands and a petition. They want menstrual products to be free and accessible. Our South Africa Bureau Chief Betty Dibia reports.
This protest march didn't get as much media attention as they expected, but the protesters marched on with their message, calling for an end to period poverty and access to free menstrual products for women and girls.
Menstrual rights are human rights.
We're pleading yet again, after so many years, after 6 years of starting this conversation, that may every person who menstruates in South Africa be free to bleed.
Young girls and women in South Africa need the menstrual health and hygiene bill now more than ever. So we're urging the South African government, together with members of parliament, to make the menstrual health and hygiene bill a reality by making menstrual rights a reality in South Africa.
Thank you for bringing men and the boy child on board. That is a significant step. I hereby acknowledge receipt of your memorandum on behalf of the department in my capacity as the Acting Director General. And I also extend an invitation to yourself to be members of the Menstrual Health Coalition, because this is where most of the issues can be addressed effectively.
Buntu, a father of a 10-year-old girl, is among the handful of male protesters, and he says he's learned how important enlightenment on period issues is, especially for men.
If we have to get that information, we have to get that knowledge, to get that teaching from our women, let's do that so that our kids, our offspring can benefit from it as men.
You know, us being here, it is a matter of having learners whom actually misses their days in school because of something that they are saying that it's lacking. And then, according to our understanding, it's not something that we are lacking, but then it's just the department doesn't want to open doors for our young ones to have that freedom of education.
Condoms are free while we have to buy sanitary towels.
Apart from private efforts to reduce period poverty in many communities, the South African government hasn't exactly looked the other way, but corruption is always a challenge.
What I understand is that the Department of Women and Children, young children and children living with disabilities has a policy that says, like, in each and every school there must be sanitary towels, and then tenders were given out to distributors, but until today we don't see pads in our schools. We have to rely on donations, and organizations don't have donations.
Corruption is something that is consuming all sectors of governance, but we need to see what the cost of that is. There are lives at stake, there is education at stake, there is dignity at stake, and there's health at stake. And I think if we get leaders and political leaders who actually care about the people, we might see the change we need.
A country like Scotland is offering free period products already. Others provide to schoolgirls in some areas. The protesters here want more progress regarding the Menstrual Health and Hygiene Bill, a call to action that involves synergy among several relevant departments, including finance, women, health, water and sanitation, as well as environment. The protesters have given the Department for Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities 15 days to respond to their demands.
Coming up next. Splat, Spain's giant Tomatina food fight returns after COVID ban. Please stay with us. Let's head over to Pakistan, where people displaced by floods in south of the country bemoan the conditions of their temporary shelter. Torrential rains and flooding have submerged a third of Pakistan and killed more than 1,100 people. Around 33 million have been affected, 15% of the 220 million strong South Asian nation. Southern Sindh province, with a population of 50 million, has been one of the hardest hit areas of the country, receiving 466% more rain than the 30-year average. The Jokobabad, one of Sindh's largest cities, an evacuee settled at a local school converted into a makeshift shelter, said the conditions of their mosquito-ridden living space were so deplorable that he would rather die. Shelter residents also complained of a lack of food to feed their families. Here's more on this report.
Pakistan reels from weeks of unprecedented and devastating flash floods, which has now begun tallying up the hits to its economy. The full extent of the damage remains to be seen as authorities wait for water levels to recede. Yet, according to the country's planning minister, Ashan Iqbal, early estimates showed they were already deep in the red.
I think it's going to be huge. So far, a very early preliminary estimate is that it is big. It is higher than $10 billion to, very early estimate, very rough estimate. But our joint survey teams comprising of NDMA, PDMA and Army are now out in the field. But many areas are still not accessible because of the water. Until water completely recedes, they will not be able to go and physically do the survey. But my hunch is that this is going to be 2 to 3 times higher than what we are estimating.
Iqbal said almost half of the country's cotton crops had been washed away by historic rainfall, a serious blow to a country whose textile sector makes up a majority of what it sells abroad. Meanwhile, severe damage to other crops caused food prices to shoot up. In Ratodero, the capital of Sindh province, 480 kilometers north of Karachi, many Pakistanis displaced by the floods took shelter in makeshift huts set up along dry patches of roads. The southern Sindh and southwestern Balochistan provinces were hit hardest by the floods that swept through farmland and towns. Large parts of both provinces and northern Pakistan districts were cut off for many days from the rest of the country. And while Pakistan has appealed for international help, some countries have already sent in supplies and rescue teams. The Chinese Air Force dispatched Y-20 transport aircraft to deliver humanitarian relief supplies to Pakistan. Loaded with 3,000 tons and other humanitarian relief supplies, several Y-20 transport aircraft departed from the international airport in southwest China's Sichuan province on its way to Pakistan.
Pakistan helped us after the Wenchuan earthquake in 2008. As the Sichuan people, I have deeply felt the brotherhood between the two countries that share will and woe and help each other. I will complete the mission successfully to express our sympathy and support to the Pakistani people.
The mission of delivering aid to Pakistan has a special meaning for a pilot who's experienced the earthquake in Wenchuan in 2008. Nearly 15% of Pakistan's entire population are currently homeless. With the death toll surpassing 1,000 and 500,000 homes being completely or partially destroyed, Pakistan is in the midst of one of its worst ever natural disasters, according to the National Disaster Management Authority.
Addressing the unsustainable and illegal sand mining practices along Nigeria's shorelines to supply the construction boom is key for not only reducing future flooding risk in Lagos, but also preserve valuable food and water resources in times of scarcity in Taiwan. The underlying causes of Lagos floods and 9 other disasters around the world is the focus of the 2021-2022 edition of the Interconnected Disaster Risk Report, each having shared root causes and drivers.
As far as alternatives, yes, this is something we go into in the report. If we can find different materials to build with, this will relieve the pressure of needing so much sand. So as we go into in the report, there's not just one solution for everything, but we need to find a mix of good solutions and apply them together. For each of the cases in the report, we give examples of what we call solution packages, where we bring solutions together that can work in combination. In Lagos, and as with other cities around the world, things like what we call letting nature work. So instead of continually taking space away from nature and degrading nature for other purposes, we start to give that space back. We start to conserve ecosystems. We start to restore them so that we can benefit from their ability to protect us from things like storm surge and flooding. This can go hand in hand with things like consuming sustainably. So we talked about sand mining, trying to find alternative materials, but also things like I mentioned, the drainage system. Consuming sustainably means less garbage, being more aware of how to manage waste. And this is something that hinders the drainage systems in Lagos, but even somewhere like New York that struggled recently during Hurricane Ida when they received more rain than the city could handle. Their aging sewer system also faces problems from people just throwing things, flushing things down the toilet and clogging things up. So it comes to the level of every person can contribute to some of these solutions.
Finally on the program, more than 20,000 revelers hurled tomatoes at each other at the La Tomatina, Spain's most famous food fight festival that returned after a 2-year hiatus due to COVID restrictions. Tourist locals cheered as trucks loaded with 130,000 tons of ripe tomatoes drove through central Bunal, 40 kilometers off coastal destination Valencia, splattering the sloppy red ammunition over the street where the food fight is held. Full celebrations on the trottle there. Well, that's it in our program this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker.